Hello, everybody. Good day. This is Tosca at NGO Soul and Strategy. And today we are going to have another episode delving deeper into the topic of feminist leadership. And I'm going to introduce to you in a moment Joanne Sandler. But before I get there, let me just remind our audience about feminist leadership. Some people would argue that it falls within the broader kind of schools of thinking and models of transformational leadership, which is a school of leadership thinking, which, if I really abbreviate it very in a nutshell, emphasizes the ability of leaders to motivate their employees to find more intrinsic meaning in their work, and leaders who are able to generate a willingness and an energy amongst staff to go over and beyond what the job requires from them. So what is feminist leadership then within that school of transformational leadership? Well, externally, easy to guess, obviously feminist leadership is focused on creating a gender-just world. But in this series for my podcast, I want to focus on the internal organizational features and manifestations of feminist leadership. So briefly, if I summarize what I understand to be what feminist leadership consists of, it is things like a pushback on a more charismatic, hero-based and individualistic leadership model. It emphasizes shared leadership and distributed leadership, distributed throughout the organization. It's definitely more of a post-heroic leadership model, as Joyce Fletcher would call it. It perhaps has some overlapping areas with servant leadership, but I'm not too sure about that. So maybe we're going to ask Joanne about that. And it's a form of leadership that is very much developmental in terms of being intent on developing people throughout the organization. It has a focus on the personal, being also the political, as comes, of course, from feminism, and a focus on self-care and staff care. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of what it might be, but really we're going to ask Joanne today how she understands it. So Joanne, let me introduce you and let me say welcome very much.
Thank you so much, Tosca. It's a pleasure to be with you.
It is my pleasure. And today is my first time to talk to you. And I've already felt that we had a swell time getting into this episode. So let me introduce you as audience to Joanne Sandler. She is a senior associate at Gender at Work, which is a consulting agency that works with organizations who wish to contribute to gender equality and to advance feminist leadership, which we're going to talk about. She's also an independent consultant, like I am. And she is also the producer of a podcast that is called Two Old Bitches, and that captures the experience of women over 50 who reinvent, reimagine, and rebel. How to grow, quote unquote, old and reclaim your voice and backbone of the bitch you always wanted to be. And I love that title, Joanne. I love it.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Joanne is also the was the deputy executive director of UN Women, or was that not called UNIFEM? In the past?
That was called UNIFEM, the UN Development Fund for Women, and we transitioned to UN Women. I was on the transition team.
Oh, you were actually. Oh gosh, that would also be an interesting topic, but for another day. And Joanne was before that also special advisor to the Assistant Secretary General of the UN. And Joanne, as you pointed out in our pre-chat, you would like to talk today particularly about how feminist leadership shows up or not in multilateral organizations, which I love as a topic, having worked for a while in both the UN at the country level and in the World Bank at country and headquarters level. I think that's an exquisite niche for us to grapple with. So, Joanne, let me start right away. What does feminist leadership mean to you, particularly in how it might show up in very large, pretty bureaucratic organizations that consists of people from lots of national cultures? How does it show up in that type of organization, and how do you see it in practice?
How does it show up? It's a really complicated and interesting question. And the answer or the experience of it, I have to say, is evolutionary, right? So your definition of feminist leadership, I think, was very good. It hit on what I think are key elements of feminist leadership, which really is about inclusion. It's about a different weave of power, a different way of understanding power, a different consciousness and intention around power. And, you know, as you said, the personal is political. And this notion that you don't check your emotion and your personal history at the door, you actually bring it into the room with you. And so the question of how does feminist leadership show up in these,
How would I see it?
yeah, where would you see it?
Yeah.
Exactly. I had a really interesting example of feminist leadership early on in my time at the UN. I started working there kind of full time. I'd done a lot of consulting there, but in 1997. And when I got there, I told Nolene Heiser, who was the executive director of UNIFEM at the time, I will only stay for 1 year. I am not a bureaucrat. I am not staying here. I ended up staying for 13 years. But the thing is that, and in those days, and still, you know, I don't know, Tosca, if you've heard the word femocrat.
I have not. Tell me about it.
So femocrat is, I think it originated in Australia in the 80s at a time when lots of feminists were coming into the public and civil service. A feminist bureaucrat. And I was doing interviews at one point about how feminists change bureaucracies and how do bureaucracies change feminists.
Oh,
And
super interesting topic.
super interesting. And a colleague of mine, a woman named Nasreen Alami, who's Jordanian Palestinian, said, the thing is, bureaucrats are supposed to be neutral. Femocrats are bureaucrats with an agenda. And the agenda is equity and equality. And I think that was actually the joy of working in a place like UNIFEM. So we were not all feminists, not all identified as feminists, but an aspirational feminist organization within a larger institution that prided itself on its neutrality.
Interesting. Lots of kind of inbuilt tensions.
Exactly.
Not necessarily in a negative way, but at least certainly present there. Before we go anywhere, I'm going to, in a moment, present you with a bit of research that I read that I think is interesting in the context that you've just discussed. But before we go there, when you said feminist leadership is about a different way of understanding power, I think I'm going to have to ask you to unpack that.
So, and you know, Lisa Van Klassen and John Gaventa and others have done a lot of really important work on dissecting the dimensions of power. So power over, power to, power with, power within, right? All those dimensions of power. And in large bureaucratic organizations, the most visible manifestation of power is power over.
Yes.
And you're, you know, as you rise up through the rank, you're increasing power to determine both people's actions, people's priorities, people's destinies at the end of the day. I mean, when I came into the UN system in the early 90s, you had to have your emails approved before you could send them out.
Right.
Those were still the days when in the country offices, when the head of the UN walked in, everybody stood up. And that was only 30 years ago.
So very much about positional power and formal authority, etc. reigned.
Exactly. Which of course feminism is calling for a completely different understanding of power. A much more nuanced understanding of power, that we come to spaces with power within, and that of course power with, collective power, shared power, power to, the power of purpose is, you know, I don't want to say more important, but a dimension of power that you need to take into account as you think about your own power. And a lot of the work, I think, that a lot of the work that I've done in the past 10 years, and because we developed a course actually for UN women on feminist, well, it's called actually Transformative Leadership for Gender Equality, which is really about how do you become a feminist leader for gender equality, is a lot of that work is really getting people to engage with their own privilege, their own power from wherever they come, and to think about how they use that to advance gender equality and women's rights, which I think is a key dimension of feminist leadership.
Yeah, yeah. So here's, before I go to the next question, here's what I wanted to kind of refer back for a moment. And I hope I can find it now. I remember, so there was a piece of research that my colleagues and I at Syracuse University at the time when I worked here that we looked at, that talked about behaviors of, we never want to essentialize how women lead and manage in organizations.
Exactly.
That's very important. Right. Having said that, there is some consistent research findings around how women generally, whether we are socialized into that or whether we are quote unquote biologically more primed for that, but have a greater tendency toward collaborative skills, leadership skills, emotional intelligence skills, etc. Anyway, it said, I think it was from a British researcher, Metcalf, and it said that women managers and leaders in the UK bureaucracy, so public bureaucracy, indeed showed such greater behaviors and were received positive feedback from their colleagues around this up till the time when those women entered into the senior civil service, and then their behaviors changed. And I thought that was really interesting. And I wonder if you can comment on that in the context of your observations over many years in multilateral organizations.
Yeah, I mean, my anecdotal empirical evidence would be yes. And why? Because reward systems are very powerful. And the multilateral system, as an example, is a pay-to-play system. Money talks, power talks, presence, personnel. It still is this place where size matters. There used to be these billboards when Godzilla came out, size matters. Yeah. And it is maybe not counterintuitive, but it contradicts the espoused values of the multilateral system. What should matter is your mandate. What should matter is your purpose and the connectedness that you have to your constituency. In fact, we saw many times that is not what matters. And so in the multilateral system and in other systems, to get ahead, to achieve positions that have more power, more voice, more authority, you have to play the game. And women and men,
yes,
and everyone across the gender spectrum, right, understands very quickly what you have to do. And so, yes, as you reach those positions of power, you learn how to pick your battles. You learn how to make your alliances, and you learn, what you can do and say in different places. And you are constantly faced, I think, with very difficult trade-offs around that.
And that it's those trade-offs that I want to go now, because I will tell you, Joanne, my impetus for starting this series on feminist leadership in my podcast is that obviously the model of leadership has had some ascendancy in some development organizations, some particularly larger INGOs, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, such as ActionAid and Oxfam, for instance. And so it's on the rise. That makes it interesting to investigate, not just for its strengths, but also I am a little, I want to make sure that we keep interrogating everything, including when something becomes a little faddish, because our sector is quite prone to what academics very fancily call isomimicry. So the mimicking of other organizations that you see as more quote unquote successful, or what you want to strive for. And so I want to now go into some of these trade-offs with you that you already just referenced. So what I wanted to do is pose a couple of scenarios and see how feminist leadership, in your opinion, where it shines and how it performs, but also where it runs into maybe some of its limits or trade-offs at least, right? Okay, so let's go there. So at its core, leadership, of course, there are thousands and thousands of definitions on the web about what it is, but one of the important things is, particularly when we talk about senior organizational level leadership, we're talking about having to balance competing values and competing interests, right? As part of a whole of organization leadership. What kind of values or interests that actually have worth might compete with those that are called for by feminist leadership, and how should leaders resolve that particular tension?
You know, that's a really big question. And
I'm sorry to start with that. Maybe it's an impossible question.
Well, I think it's very related to context. I mean, context, you know, is everything. And I think about it I'd like to give an example.
Please.
Right? So, because not only did I work in a space in the UN that had feminist aspirations, but we were working on gender equality. That was our mandate. Right? And there are many people in the UN that work on gender equality. And it's always a kind of internal conundrum when you work on an issue, whether it's gender equality or diversity or
disability, or
disabilities, et cetera. When you're in an organization that is hierarchical and you are hired to actually work to change something intrinsic about that organization, because it is an intrinsically unequal organization, right?
Right.
Within the UN, there are great inequalities. And racism and sexism and ableism and ageism. And so you're working in a space where you're actually called upon to give visibility to those inequities and change them, which of course no one really wants you to do. So you're almost set up for failure. And so you come in contact, or I did, and now I'm talking about, the 90s, with others in the institution who are also tasked with advancing gender equality, but have a very different understanding of what that requires. And so just to give you an example, in the 90s, in the 90s, which wasn't that long ago, the issue of violence against women in all of its forms, particularly in the early 90s, was viewed as not an issue that we discuss in the multilateral system. It was private. It was a private issue. It's something that happens in the domestic sphere, not the public sphere.
And the personal was not political.
Exactly. And then through the early 90s and the world conferences, that changed. And so slowly but surely, we kind of chipped away at that resistance. In the late 90s, at UNIFEM, we wanted to hold a big video conference. We didn't even know what a video conference was at that time, on ending violence against women. We wanted the Secretary General to come, and we wanted the General Assembly to be the site, et cetera, et cetera. And at that time, others who worked on gender equality in the system tried to stop us from doing that because they said we would embarrass the UN. Now, their value was around the UN and the importance of multilateralism. Our value was around ending violence against women and the human rights of women and girls, and that women's rights were human rights, as they said in the Beijing World Conference and the World Conference on Human Rights. And we were in an immediate clash with our own peers, some of whom had much greater power than we did, trying to stop us. And it was really interesting. And we ultimately did hold the video conference in the General Assembly, and the Secretary General did come, and he said he would stay for 20 minutes, but he stayed for an hour and 40 minutes, and it was extraordinary. But the way we got to hold that was that as we were negotiating, a woman called me, because I was kind of the lead from Unifem side.
Mm-hmm.
A woman called me who was the head of the staff union. Out of the blue, I didn't know who she was. And
Yeah.
she said, I know what you're trying to do, and I can help you because staff unions have power. And I will use our power to make sure that you can hold this in the General Assembly. And she did. She did what she had to do to make that happen. And
Yeah.
so I say that because I think, feminist leadership appears often in the most unlikely spaces. I didn't know her. I didn't know she was a feminist. I didn't know she was a feminist leader. But it is that very loose network and the power
With
right?
You're right.
The informal networks of feminist leaders within organizations that hold those organizations as dearly and see the value as much as anybody else, but also understand that those organizations have to change. And so
Yes.
being that internal change agent.
Yes. Yes. How about another scenario? Crisis leadership, right? So in crisis leadership, you will often see that leaders in crisis, depending on their personality, will contract decision making into a much smaller circle of people, right? Although there are some others who have actually a tendency to go out and consult a hell of a lot of people as they try to figure out what to do. But how well does feminist leadership hold up in crisis situations in your experience?
I mean, I think what we see right now in this pandemic and watching my feminist sisters and brothers who work in feminist organizations and how they have responded to the pandemic, I think is a testimony to how well it holds up. Because, Tosca, the thing is, you wouldn't decide to start being a feminist leader in the middle of a crisis. You would have been working up. And so I think that in organizations where leadership styles and an understanding of how one uses power from a feminist perspective, where that has had a trajectory over time, so that there's already a tradition of shared leadership. There's already trust. There's already a way of talking to each other and working together, and an understanding of when someone needs to take individual action. Instead of seeing that as sabotage or betrayal, people understand it because you've already built those relationships.
Okay. So you're saying as long as the foundations for shared leadership and trust, etc., have been built, that will then allow in a crisis situation where leaders in formal positional power may have to say, okay, we now have to make really quick decisions and I cannot consult everybody before we go somewhere in terms of action, that will pay off. But if that wasn't established ahead of time, then there is a bit more of a tension, right?
Also, yes, and because there are shared values. So the feminist organizations that I have been in touch with during these last 6 months, for instance, it's been very impressive the way that leaders, and I'm talking about not just formal executive director or presidents, but leaders within, whether they're heads of country offices or they're, heads of regional programs, immediately stopped and said, okay, what do we need to do to take care of each other and our partners? How do we build on what we've been doing and shift to the extent that we need to make sure that we are going to get through this together? And I've been so impressed. I've been so impressed because there has been so much uncertainty. And I think it is also recognizing that uncertainty, recognizing that your strategic plan, your results framework, your whatever, is not going to get you through this. That is not what we're going to rely on at this moment. So I have seen and been really impressed with the way that feminist organizations and feminist leaders have navigated these last 6 months.
But now I'm going to push you a little bit and say, where have you seen the limitations show up of this particular leadership model? Because I find it hard to believe that, to be a little provocative, that any leadership model will always, in all scenarios and all circumstances, only show its strengths. Have you seen limitations show up that have caused you to kind of rejig or nuance the applicability or utility of feminist leadership? I'm going to be a little provocative here.
I mean, I don't think you can necessarily pin it on a leadership theory, right? I think, yes, in the sense that if we look at kind of the twin awakenings of both the pandemic and what's happened with Black Lives Matter and anti-racism and feminist actors and feminist activists and advocates turning in on themselves to question how racism lives in our movements and our organizations. I think that there has been a really important awakening. I think that it has also created some paralysis, fear.
Has it?
Confusion, sure, because I think, a big mirror is being held up to all of us who work on social justice, from whatever perspective. And I don't see it as, you see, the thing about feminist leadership, I think, is that it has to be both a theory and a practice, right? And we can have really strong grounding in what feminist leadership is. And I think it is always aspirational. We are always learning. We are always making mistakes. We are always trying to do better. So in any particular moment, I think, for instance, many of the organizations that have experienced disruptions and internal crises because of this moment of opportunity to really confront racism. I think that, it has generated a conversation about, were we really feminist leaders? Were we really walking our talk, or did we have really good talk and a very problematic walk?
Talk to me a little bit more about the fear that you mentioned in this setting right now, since we're questioning ourselves as social justice organizations when it comes to racism.
Yeah. Well, again, very complex, because it goes back to, I think, one of the real values of feminist leadership, which is the requirement to confront your own privilege and power. How are you using it? And I think, there's a great tape that it's a YouTube that women who have transitioned to men, who have gone through a gender transition from women to men, and there's a great, very funny tape on male privilege from the perspective of women who have transitioned.
Okay.
And one of the men in that tape says, it's not a problem to have privilege. The challenge is how you use that privilege. And so we all have different kinds of privileges. And I think that is what is happening now, is that we are questioning, have we used our privilege for the right things? Have we used our privilege to create more space, to create more honesty, to create more transparency and opportunity? And I think the answer is no, we have not.
We have not. No, you and I talked about that before we started our recording. Maybe one more question before we turn to how people can learn more about you. So you've worked in the multilateral system, as you said, for a long time. obviously national cultures influence also what is expected of us as leaders, right? In terms of the leadership behaviors that are expected of us based on our understanding of national culture. And sometimes those expectations can be in tension with with organizational aspired or espoused leadership models, right?
Yeah.
Such as feminist leadership. What do we do then? How does that?
Say more. Can you say more
Yeah,
about that
sure.
question?
For instance, if we think about, let me go to the classical kind of private sector born male model of hero-based leadership, right, where the leader needs to be out in front a lot, needs to at least make the appearance that he or she or they know what needs to be done, etc.
Yeah.
There are still many national cultures and across the world that would say that that is how leaders ought to behave,
Yeah.
right? And then you have post-heroic models, and feminist leadership being one of them. So here I come from such a national culture, and I enter an organization that says our espoused leadership model is feminist leadership, and that is post-heroic. But back home, at home, in my community, etc., I am still expected to be that heroic type of leader. How have you seen people struggle, individual leaders struggle with that tension, literally from when they leave their home into the multilateral organization and back at the end of the day? And what kind of organizational dynamics does that cause?
You know, the thing is that in any organization, you are negotiating so many differences. That's just one of the differences. I mean, national culture, absolutely. Family culture,
Yeah.
you know, gender culture, ethnicity, education, ability. I mean, all of those things, I think, play in. And I think that I don't think feminist leadership is saying that people can't lead or can't shine or can't get recognition or can't be the decider. I think that feminist leadership is asking for, or it really, you know, asking for you to take leadership around non-discrimination, around intersectionality, to lead for gender equality, to lead for a purpose. And so I don't, you know, the fact that we talk in feminist leadership about power sharing, about inclusion, et cetera, doesn't mean that you can't have a leader. It means that that leader is leading so that, so the typical thing is, you know, yes, I'm the hero. Now we know in multilateral systems, the head of a department, the head of an organization, for the most part, does not write their own speeches, does not write their own articles, has a lot of people working to help them with everything.
Yeah.
And then appears miraculously as the all-knowing, whatever, speechifier. A feminist leader would still appear and would acknowledge the people who wrote the speech, the team that helped them get
That it's
there, et
about
cetera, et
we
cetera.
and not about I.
Exactly. But it doesn't mean, I don't think it should be confused with not shining, not taking the space, not taking the power, not using the power. A feminist leader uses her or his power to make things happen so that there is a more inclusive, equal world. But, you know, power is there. It's always there, and it
It's
needs to
always
be
there,
used.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very helpful for me, the way you explain that. Okay, so Joanne, to come to an end of our interview here. So if people want to learn more about you and your work, etc., where can they find you on the web? Where should they look?
There are so many places. I mean, first of all, through Gender at Work. And
Okay.
I would,
We'll
of
get that
course,
up.
always want to pitch our book, Gender
And
at Work, which...
and Joanne is now holding it up, and I will put a reference to it in the show notes.
Good, because one of the things I think that Gender at Work, the network that I belong to, in which Aruna Rao and David Kelleher co-founded, is that we use a very simple but provocative framework, analytical framework. And it helps you to start. Some of the questions you asked, Tosca, are about the deep structures that hold gender inequality and other inequalities in place. And I know you're very interested in those too. And so part of the work that we do as gender at work, but I think also just as feminists and people with inquiring minds, right?
Yeah.
Is really try to interrogate, what are those deep structures? What are the deep structures that, despite the policies you have, despite the commitments that you make, despite your mandate and your mission, keep sabotaging your best intentions?
Yes.
And so I think that's something I've dedicated my life to trying to understand and continue to. So I think through Gender at Work, through one of the things, Gender at Work has a podcast also, the Gender at Work Book Club. And
we'll put a link to that.
Yeah, do that, because we're actually going to do an episode on, I recently wrote an article with Anne-Marie Gutz about whether or not the UN can deliver a feminist future. And we're going to do a podcast on that. So I'd love for your listeners to
we can
also join the debate.
Yes, we can definitely link to that. Well, thank you so much, Joanne, for all your insight. It was such a lovely and insightful conversation. And thank you, listeners. If you found this podcast episode stimulating, there will be more on the topic to come with other thinkers and doers in this space, such as Lisa Vinneklaase, Srilata Batliwala, who is one of the grandmothers, as Joanna said at the beginning of our podcast, of feminist leadership, and others. I also wanted to just reference the fact that the book that I helped co-author, called Between Power and Irrelevance, The Future of Transnational NGOs, was just published in July and seems to be making the rounds, which we're grateful for. That book does have a chapter on our observations on leadership in the INGO sector, including some significant leadership blind spots as we see it. And that chapter references feminist leadership briefly as well. You can find more information about that book on my website, fiveoaksconsulting.org. So this is Tosca, and I look forward to spending time with you next time on NGO, Soul and Strategy.